Hello and welcome to the Hustle and Bustle podcast. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is being recorded, the Yugambeh people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Nicole Bennett and I'm an urban and regional planner, and I'm the host of this podcast. Each episode I bring you conversations with city shapers and urban thinkers, leaders in the field of urban planning and city building. I'm located here on the beautiful Gold Coast in Australia. We're one of the host cities for the Brisbane 2032 Olympics and Paralympics. The next 10 years is being described as the golden decade for our city and our region. The conversations on this podcast help us understand the opportunities and challenges ahead. So let's take a minute from our busy hustle and bustle day and let's have a great conversation. And welcome to episode 12 for this year. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Barbara Norman. She's the Foundation Chair of the Urban and Regional Planning and a Director of the Canberra Urban and Regional Futures at the University of Canberra. Professor Norman is Chair of the ACT Climate Change Council and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University. Barbara is Life Fellow and past National President of the Planning Institute of Australia and Life Honorary Member of the Royal Town Planning Institute in the UK. Barbara holds a Bachelor of Town and Regional Planning, Masters of Environmental Law and a PhD in Sustainable Coastal Planning. She also has substantial professional background, having worked at all levels of government and also ran her own practice. Her current research and teaching interests include sustainable cities and regions, coastal planning, climate change adaptation and urban governance. Barbara was a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 5 Working Group 2 report on impacts in 2013. Professor Norman advises the public and private sectors here in Australia and has strong international links within Asia, Europe and United States. Barbara was awarded an Australian Centenary Medal for her contribution to the community through urban and regional planning. Professor Norman is a true legend of planning and I'm just absolutely honoured to be chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Nicole. And I'm a little envious of where you are because in Canberra it was -3 degrees this morning and and felt like -7. So it's pretty fresh here, but at least the sun is shining. I just wanted to say that I finished as chair of the ACT Climate Change Council. By legislation, you just can do 2 terms, and my terms have concluded. But anyway, just as an update, thank you.
Oh, thank you for updating that bio. But what an impressive bio you have, and you know you've done everything in planning. I think you know as the bio says, you've worked at all levels of government, and you've really got that broad perspective. And you know you've sort of contributed to some significant pieces of work and changes in our profession. So, you know, I'm in awe of you. And I've said to you when we were just chatting earlier that I've followed you on Twitter for some time and I really love all of the perspectives and expertise that you put out there. And you've had such a diverse career across academia and research now, and those leadership roles in those peak bodies, such as the National President of the Planning Institute of Australia. So I'd love to just pick your brain a bit today about planning, about your career, and just to sort of for people to understand your perspectives and where you've been and come from, what your top career highlights are. So how would you describe those kind of top moments in your career and why are they the highlights?
Well, I've occurred for different reasons at different times. Maybe I'll go back a little bit in time. One of the most formative projects I worked on was transforming the city of Melbourne from a commercial retail centre to a much more livable centre with housing, residential development, mixed use, and all the activities you see today. I was a young planner. I worked for the state government department and then in Premier and Cabinet at quite a young professional age in my 20s. And we were on something called the Central Area Task Force. It's very hard for people to understand that back then I could literally walk to each residential place, not even development place, in the centre of the city, in the CBD. There was virtually no residential living in the centre of Melbourne, and that's very hard for people to understand today. I was the first project officer for the South Bank development, which is just huge now. Nothing existed then, just old railway lines, and no one even knew who owned the land. So that was a very formative project and transformational one, and that really inspired me to continue in planning for the rest of my career, really. So that was one. I think another, I won't go through it all, but the second one that I really learnt a great deal from was when I moved to Canberra. I married, I was going to say someone, I married my then husband at the time, brought me to Canberra from Melbourne, and I took up a job in Queanbeyan in New South Wales, and I was the senior planner for the southeast region of New South Wales, from Kosciuszko to the coast. And so that was my experience. I'd had a little bit before, but solid experience in regional planning, in non-metropolitan planning, in working with rural councils, dealing with issues around national parks and coastal edges and everything in between. And that was a fantastic opportunity. And I really loved it until I had a young baby, and it was getting kind of challenging to be going to Kosciuszko and breastfeeding at the same time. So I then moved to a role more easily done at that time, to bring all those family and work responsibilities together at the university, at this ANU actually.
Yeah, okay.
And then a third one I'll just mention is, which possibly people don't know so much about my background. I was housing commissioner in the ACT. So I had a really strong, and I also worked on the national housing strategy at the time. I had quite a strong period in my career working on housing issues. And obviously as a commissioner with public housing and all the responsibilities there, and then on national housing policy at the time under the, I guess it would have been the Keating government during the mid-90s, late 90s. And so I just mentioned those three, so urban, non-urban, and housing, and of course all my work in climate change today. It's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And just shows the diversity of what a planner does, doesn't it?
For sure. I think planning is really quite unique in the sense that it has a really strong capacity to connect the dots, to bring different threads together, presented in a spatial way, which is not just beneficial for planning, but beneficial for the community to gain a deeper understanding of what's happening. And also, unusually, it has a temporal dimension. We plan for the future, and there aren't many professions so specifically actively involved in that. So, yeah, I think planning is about to go through a renaissance. I think the value of planning, and I'm seeing this in all the climate change discussions, the value of planning is being restored, if you like. It went through a bit of a difficult time, cut the red tape and fast track everything, and got a bit of a negative reputation for a while, but even the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on adaptation, you can find this on the IPCC website, specifically talks about climate resilient planning and development and the value of planning. And so I see it being championed from different quarters globally. And I suspect we might see more of a conversation around this with the election of the new government as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes to my next question, Barbara, around what motivates and drives you as a planner today?
Definitely what's always motivated me, but even more so today is it's an old-fashioned concept of common good, community good. And it's one of those, it can be a powerful instrument in making very positive changes to a community. And certainly where you're based in southeast Queensland, you would know that well. And when we work together, especially when councils work together in a more regional sense, when we cooperate and collaborate, we can actually do fantastic things. So just coming back to my city, putting an urban planner as chair of the Climate Change Council, I think was a smart move by the government in connecting those threads. And we committed in 2011 to be 100% renewable electricity by 2020, and we achieved that. And I think that skills of a planner, quite often planners end up chairing things, chairing boards, or take up senior executive roles because they have this ability to bring things together. I think that, yes, again, what inspires me is we can leave it a better place.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now shifting to climate change, I'm keen to understand, and I've asked this question of a few guests, and you're the first one I've asked since the change of government. So I'm interested to see whether this is a slight shift in the response here. But I'm interested in the key barriers for Australia in adapting to climate change and sort of what they are and how we might sort of look to address those barriers.
Well, certainly the change of government has removed quite a few of those barriers. In that just yesterday they announced a mega department for climate change, bringing all these dimensions together. Although planning would still be under the other Department of Infrastructure, can't remember its long name yet, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. I think I got it.
And do we know where cities sit? Is that over there?
Well, cities would sit in there, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I guess that brings the first point, that those two mega departments will need to work together to be effective in, for example, in embedding climate change considerations into regional development programs and plans would be very important. Embedding climate change criteria into any national infrastructure decisions is very important. Encouraging, probably more than just encouraging, states and territories to amend their planning legislation to embed climate change specifically in the law, which I'm strongly arguing for, have been for a while and will continue to. In fact, I've just submitted a book for publication for COP27, sorry, in November this year.
And in Egypt.
In Egypt, yes. Yeah. And it's called Urban Planning for Climate Change, so pretty well.
Very apt.
Yeah. But in doing that, I have looked at the planning acts around the world, and Australia has some catching up to do, and I'm sure we can, but it will require, I'd like to see the planning ministers brought together with the new federal minister to tease through some of these things. The UK Town and Country Planning Act, climate change is absolutely front and centre of the legislation now. American Planning Association, very strong on action on climate change. Australian Planning Institute now has a strong policy on climate change, which is good. So coming back to a question, what needs to happen? So the first thing that we need to do, which we haven't done properly yet, is to map the risks, the climate risks, and overlay that where existing development is and importantly, where future growth corridors are planned. So we can identify where there might be areas at risk and vulnerabilities. Then we need to be having a program funded by state governments and supported by higher levels of government, nationally I would argue as well, for working to establish processes to work with vulnerable communities to work out climate resilient plans for those particular areas as a priority. And then thirdly, we need to make sure that we're not adding to the legacy that we already have by continuing to build on flood-prone land or areas of extreme fire risk or coastal inundation. So there's some really practical steps that need to happen. And the fourth one I would add is we need to be upskilling land use planners and built environment professionals generally in at least understanding the basics of climate change, so they have more confidence in advising decision makers, mayors, local councils on these issues. So more formally part of the curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes into that point of proactive planning rather than reacting when, climate impacts occur, and we were affected in southeast Queensland by the recent floods, two sets of flooding events, these 1 in 100 year type events that people talk about, that we know are not 1 in 100 years, but it's that whole kind of, these disasters that happen and everyone kind of gains a momentum around we need to do something different. And then, now we've got sunny days again. And I just hope that momentum lasts and that people see that there needs to be a change in the way that we plan our community so that they are more resilient when these events do occur in the future.
We actually know what to do. We know that, whether it's mitigation with carbon neutral development or adaptation with urban forestry and water sensitive urban design and stepping back from the coast. The Gold Coast, of course, is, and I've said that publicly for a long time, an area at risk, simply just the geography and the coasts and potential for flooding. So we know what to do. We just need to put it into action and be proactive. And I do think it's an opportunity, as with all challenges, for planning to step forward and to show leadership and advocate strongly about how we can make a very positive contribution to communities at risk. But I will also add that we're past the point of guidelines and advisory notes. It doesn't work. We've done that for the last 10 years. It's not changing, or too slowly. So I actually am strongly in support of regulation. When people say industry will react, that's a myth, really. Industry looks for certainty. They want to know what the rules are. They want to know what the certainty is, and then they will adjust accordingly and invest accordingly. Just to finish on that note, I was speaking to someone from the insurance industry, actually only this morning, and she was saying that increasingly they hear that the insurance sector will sort it out. They won't insure areas. Well, the insurance industry aren't happy with this because they're saying that it's too late then. So that's after the event.
Yep.
What we need to be is investing in planning in the future. And I guess that was a really positive note back to the planning profession, that the insurance industry is looking to planning to take a forward lead and be proactive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you say that around sick of guidelines and fact sheets. I completely agree. And I was listening to the World Economic Forum and the mayor of Miami had some interesting things, and he was talking about carrot and sticks, and it, the simple kind of, what's the carrot, how are you going to kind of encourage people to do better? What are you going to sort of give them to, to do something? But you need the stick, right? Because there's going to be some people that might follow the carrot, but you still need the regulation to actually make sure that people do make the changes. And he was talking about the vulnerabilities of the city of Miami in the US.
The city of Miami is a very interesting case study. They're spending millions on just elevating the road next to the beach. They're at risk, knowing that that's not going to solve the problem, but the real estate is so expensive there that that's what they're going to do, and knowing it might just buy them 15, 20 years. But it looks pretty serious down the track for Miami.
I was going to ask you, Barbara, what are the most innovative solutions you've seen in your work to adapting to climate change? We talk about, or we hear about, technology and some of these other kind of, opportunities for adapting to climate change. How can we see the opportunities that exist?
Well, there's some excellent work happening around the world. In terms of managing floods and flood risk, Copenhagen has done some brilliant work there. It's called a cloudburst plan. It's won international awards. And that's about, really, it's what we describe as water-sensitive urban design, but almost water-sensitive urban design on steroids. It's so they look at retaining, recycling, and absorbing shock downfalls through their drainage system, but also recycling all of that back into a green open space and wetlands. That's just one example. The other, I guess, significant ones in the transport area: light rail, rapid rail, smart infrastructure, electric cars, electrification of the whole transport system, if you like, is an exciting future. In terms of commercial buildings and housing, carbon neutral developments clearly is the goal. When I say that, though, I will say that one thing I think we're really weak on still is evaluation and monitoring of outcomes. So certainly I know of examples where, even in my own town, where I know that concessions, like carrots, I guess, financial concessions have been given for 5-star developments, but no one's really gone back. So they've taken those, the developers, but no one's actually gone back to check whether that's been implemented.
Yeah.
Then or over time. Often it's the budget item that's got the least money or even deleted when it comes to constraints, but it's something we have to invest in the future, because if we're going to be looking at outcomes like carbon neutral development, we need to have really clear criteria, and we need to have performance evaluation monitoring with that. So look, there's great examples around the world. In terms of, I have to say, in terms of coastal planning, Australia is not bad. You know, at least 96% of our coast is in public ownership, which puts us way ahead of many countries. And we have really amazing system of national parks and areas that flank our coast. We need to be focusing on our higher density areas. We also need to be focusing on those areas that are vulnerable and at risk, and equity considerations come in here, where it might be a low-lying caravan park, it might be some of our Indigenous communities, it might be areas that are not Miami or North Sydney beaches, that are wealthy areas that have the capacity to move and adapt or negotiate with government. But I think as planners, we should be very mindful of those areas that actually need our help.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the carbon neutral development. Have you had much experience or seen many carbon positive developments where they actually have a positive impact on the carbon footprint?
Not in Australia, I don't think, but there probably is. Certainly we've got carbon neutral developments in Canberra that have been built and under budget and working very well. Example at the Australian National University is their environment area, the Fenner School building. That's exactly that. So there are examples. Carbon positive? No, I'd like to. And I know that I think that an ambition of the Games is to be carbon positive. So I think that's your role, Nicole. I think up in your part of the world to lead the way and show us how it can be done. But if you look at New York is just leading. New York City is leading in this space, and supported by their New York City panel on climate change, has great examples. I interviewed the co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change, Joel Towers, for my forthcoming book, and he made a really good point that resonates when I repeat it to people, that 90%, they estimate 90% of the development in the city of New York right now will still be there in 2050. So in that sense, we're already in 2050. This is why people often say, 2050, whatever. This is why we actually have to, this is why now matters. I think that keeping in touch with organisations like that will help you innovate and find some carbon positive development examples. It's a good question, Nicole, one I will have a look at more closely myself.
Yeah, cool. And look, that's what you've just said there, around 90% of the built environment being around in 2050. It was echoed at that World Economic Forum. And we were sort of, when I was listening to that, it sort of occurred to me that it's about the reuse and adaptability and what we can do to that existing built environment to make it sustainable, to make it resilient, and how can we kind of augment the existing environment to achieve our goals, rather than think about what new builds could do, because they're going to be in the minority.
Exactly. That's and when we think of cities, we often focus on urban fringe development, but in fact, the suburbia is where most people live. And so it comes back to my point about training, though. The industry needs to be equipped to have the skills to be able to do the adaptive reuse. The planners need to have the skills to be able to assess and support adaptive reuse projects. So there is a lot of upskilling to be done. And in that sense, the planning institutes and the other built environment institutes, Institute of Architects, Landscape Architects, Engineers Australia, have a really important role now as well to play in making sure that the professions are able to give the advice that the communities need to be able to make these changes.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I have one last question for you, and I know you said that the Brisbane Olympics is the role of my neck of the woods, but I'm keen to understand, and the sort of theme of this overall podcast is the opportunities and challenges leading up to the Olympics in 2032. So it's only 10 years away. And what would your advice be to the planners and the people involved in Brisbane around maximising the benefits of these games? Is there sort of anything that comes to mind that, or you think, anything you can share from your perspective?
Well, I think that, one, it's a fantastic opportunity. But I would be looking at two streams: demonstration examples of excellence and to push the boundaries. Like, take it, if you think that's excellent, push yourselves even harder and really explore the boundaries. But also, it's more than flagship projects. It's also about process. And I keep talking about process now. And it's one thing that I've learned myself through the process of writing this recent book, that it is more than flagship projects. It's much more than that. It's about cultural change. It's about processes that embed climate change action through everyday decision making in everything that we do. And so I think that's important as well, that you show not only flagship projects, but also be an exemplar in, just like we have with air quality, just like we have with heritage, all sorts of issues we've dealt with. Climate change action has become the norm. It's just a standard thing that we do in Brisbane, and we always look for and keeping up to date with the latest science. So, for example, City of New York again passed the bylaw. It is mandatory to include the latest science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the City of New York plan. Mandatory, right? It's not an optional, extra, discretionary. It's the law. And so I think City of Brisbane, the Olympic Games more broadly, for Queensland, is a wonderful opportunity to showcase excellence about projects, but also how to get it done.
That's awesome. Look, that's so great. Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing all of your knowledge and your expertise, and just being a breath of fresh air and an inspiration to many of us in the industry who have watched your many kind of publications and positions. So I'm looking forward to this book. When will it be released?
It's planned to be launched at COP27. But I don't know. I've got a feeling they might be getting it out a little earlier.
Awesome.
So we'll see what happens, but definitely for COP27.
And you'll be heading to Egypt?
That's the plan. I do attend COP meetings, usually as part of the ANU delegation, and I plan to do that this year, subject to geopolitics, COVID, everything else.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's awesome. I looked forward to seeing everything that comes from COP27 because I think just in the last 12 months, the change in attitudes worldwide, but here in Australia as well, have been huge. So I really hope that that starts translating into some real action.
I'm very confident it will. And just to finish, the Glasgow, I encourage people, your listeners, to look at the Glasgow communique that came, I think it was called the Glasgow Climate Pact. You'll find it on the web. Outcome of COP26 for the first time very clearly talked about urban planning and have asked all the nation states to report back on what they're doing about that and at COP27. So planning, again, is coming to the fore very strongly.
Awesome. I might link that in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time. It's been much appreciated.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Nicole, for the opportunity.
Not a problem. And thank you for tuning into the Hustle and Bustle podcast this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and a review. You can follow the show on LinkedIn and Instagram too. That's all from this episode. Thanks again for listening. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.